The destroyer weighed 2,000 tons and moved at 38 knots through pitch-black water. The patrol boat weighed 56 tons and floated dead in the strait with engines off. When steel met plywood at 0230 hours on August 2, 1943, physics dictated only one outcome: the complete obliteration of the smaller vessel and every man aboard. Yet 11 sailors survived a collision that should have vaporized them, and the young officer who led them through 6 days of salt water, coral reefs, and enemy-infested islands would later become President of the United States. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The encounter in Blackett Strait represents a paradox that defined the entire PT boat program in World War II. These vessels were conceived as giant killers, small enough to hide in darkness, fast enough to escape retaliation, and armed with torpedoes powerful enough to sink capital ships. The Imperial Japanese Navy dismissed them as pests, nuisances that buzzed through tropical straits but rarely drew blood. They called them the Mosquito Fleet, a name meant to convey irritation rather than respect, the recognition that something small and persistent might sting but could not kill. Then on that moonless night, one of these Mosquito boats collided with a Fubuki-class destroyer traveling at combat speed, absorbed the impact of a vessel 40 times its weight, broke in half, caught fire, scattered its crew across dark water, and yet delivered every conscious survivor to shore alive. The story of how wooden boats built in New Jersey boatyards became symbols of American determination in the Pacific begins not with courage, but with skepticism. The United States Navy entered the 1930s with almost no interest in motor torpedo boats. European navies had developed fast attack craft during World War I, using them to harass battle fleets and contest narrow waters where larger ships could not maneuver. The Royal Navy built coastal motor boats that achieved modest success. The Italian MAS boats torpedoed the Austro-Hungarian battleship Sentistvan in 1918, proving that small vessels could threaten capital ships under the right conditions. But American naval doctrine revolved around the decisive fleet engagement, battleships meeting battleships in open water, cruisers screening the flanks, destroyers launching coordinated torpedo attacks at long range. There existed no tactical framework for 70-foot plywood boats crewed by 13 men carrying 4 torpedoes. The concept violated everything the Navy understood about combat power. Warships achieved fighting capability through displacement, armor, and sustained firepower. They absorbed punishment and delivered it over time. The motor torpedo boat concept inverted this logic. It substituted vulnerability for speed, armor for concealment, sustained combat for hit-and-run strikes. A single shell from a destroyer's 5-inch gun could obliterate a PT boat. Machine gun fire could riddle its hull. Even the wake from a cruiser passing at speed might swamp it. These vessels had no business in modern naval warfare, or so the doctrine suggested. Yet World War II began in September 1939, and by mid-1940 Germany controlled the European coastline from Norway to Spain. Britain stood alone, its survival dependent on keeping sea lanes open while its home fleet guarded against invasion. Small fast attack craft suddenly appeared essential, not for fleet actions, but for coastal defense, harbor patrol, and hit-and-run attacks against German shipping in the narrow seas. The Royal Navy's need created pressure on American designers to produce similar vessels. If war came to the United States, the Navy might need fast attack craft for harbor defense and amphibious operations in the Pacific Island chains. In July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, the Navy conducted competitive trials between different motor torpedo boat designs. Elco Naval Division, owned by the Electric Boat Company, submitted a 77-foot design based on British Vosper boats. Higgins Industries of New Orleans presented a 78-foot design developed from their landing craft expertise. The trials at the Brooklyn Navy Yard tested speed, maneuverability, seaworthiness, and handling characteristics. Elco's boat achieved 41 knots in calm water. The Higgins boat reached 43 knots but showed less stability in turns. Both far exceeded the Navy's minimum requirement of 35 knots. The Navy ordered both types into production, hedging its bets on competing designs. Elco refined their hull to 80 feet and adopted a hard chine design that provided better high-speed handling. The hull was built from 2 layers of 1-inch mahogany planking laid diagonally over oak frames, with cotton fabric and marine glue between layers. This double-planked construction provided strength without excessive weight. The entire hull weighed roughly 20 tons empty. The boat carried 3 Packard for M2500 12-cylinder marine engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower at 2,400 revolutions per minute. These engines were marinized versions of the Packard aircraft engine, burning 100-octane aviation gasoline. At full throttle, the 3 engines consumed 474 gallons per hour and generated enough power to push the boat past 40 knots, about 46 miles per hour, across calm water. But speed was only useful if you had firepower. The original armament consisted of 4 21-inch torpedo tubes mounted on the deck, 2 per side, each tube containing a Mark 8 torpedo. The Mark 8 weighed 2,800 pounds, carried a 466-pound TNT warhead, and could run 16,000 yards at 36 knots. In theory, a single Mark 8 could sink a cruiser or cripple a battleship. In practice, hitting a moving ship at night from a small boat bouncing through waves at 40 knots was nearly impossible. The Mark 8 also required launching from a tube, adding weight and complexity to the boat. Defensive armament included twin .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in rotating turrets, typically 1 forward and 1 aft. The M2 could fire 650 rounds per minute with an effective range of 1,800 yards against surface targets. Later boats added 20mm Oerlikon cannons, 37mm guns, and additional .50 caliber positions, transforming PT boats from torpedo platforms into gunboats as the war progressed and their actual combat role diverged from their designed mission. The fuel system aboard an Elco 80-foot PT boat represented one of the vessel's most vulnerable features. 3 fuel tanks, positioned amidships and aft, held a total of 3,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline. This fuel type was chosen because the Packard marine engines were derived from aircraft power plants and required high-octane fuel to achieve their rated horsepower. But aviation gasoline possessed characteristics that made it extraordinarily dangerous aboard a small wooden vessel. It vaporized at room temperature, creating explosive fumes in any enclosed space. It ignited easily. A single spark, a hot engine component, or even a tracer round striking the hull near a fuel tank could trigger an explosion. The fuel tanks were protected only by the mahogany planking of the hull and some internal baffles. A direct hit from any weapon larger than a rifle round would rupture them. The Elco 80-foot PT boat had a crew of 14, though this varied by mission and armament load. The commanding officer was typically a lieutenant junior grade, often called a JAG in Navy slang. The executive officer was an ensign. The rest were enlisted men, quartermaster, radioman, motor machinist's mates, torpedoman, and gunner's mates. These were young crews, averaging in their early 20s, selected for the PT service because it promised action and autonomy. A PT boat skipper operated independently, making tactical decisions in real time without the layered command structure of a capital ship. This attracted ambitious officers and adventurous sailors who wanted to fight the war on their own terms. The engines required constant maintenance. The Packard for M2500 was a sophisticated piece of machinery, 2,500 cubic inches of displacement organized into a VR12 configuration with aluminum heads, steel cylinders, and precision machine components throughout. Each engine weighed 1,400 pounds dry. Operating at 2,400 revolutions per minute under combat conditions generated tremendous heat and stress. Engine failures were common: broken valve springs, fouled spark plugs, overheated bearings, cracked cylinder heads. Motor machinists' mates worked 12-hour shifts keeping the engines operational, changing oil, adjusting valve timing, replacing worn parts. A PT boat with all 3 engines running properly was considered combat-ready. A boat with 2 engines operational could still fight but at reduced speed. A boat with 1 engine was effectively crippled, unable to outrun any enemy vessel. The torpedo systems presented even greater challenges. The Mark 8 torpedo was a steam-powered weapon, using a wet heater system where fuel and water mixed to generate steam that drove the propeller. The torpedo weighed 2,800 pounds, measured 21 inches in diameter, and stretched 24 feet in length. It carried a 466-pound TNT warhead in the nose, with depth and steering mechanisms amidships and the propulsion system in the tail. In theory, a properly functioning Mark 8 could run straight and true for 16,000 yards at 36 knots. In practice, mechanical problems plagued the weapon. Depth regulators sometimes failed, causing the torpedo to run too deep or too shallow. Steering gyroscopes drifted, sending torpedoes off course. The steam propulsion system occasionally malfunctioned, causing the torpedo to run slow or stop entirely. And even when the torpedo functioned perfectly, hitting a moving target from a small boat at night required precise calculations of target course, speed, and range, calculations that were nearly impossible to make accurately in combat conditions. By April 1943, hundreds of PT boats operated in the Pacific Theater. The Solomons campaign had become a grinding attritional struggle. American forces had secured Guadalcanal, but Japanese garrisons still held islands to the north, Columbangara, New Georgia, Vella La Vella. The Tokyo Express, which Americans called by that name and Japanese called the Rat Run, moved troops and supplies down the island chain almost every night. Japanese destroyers would race south through the narrow straits, offload troops or supplies, and race back north before American air power could intercept them at dawn. These runs typically occurred in darkness, the destroyers relying on speed and the cover of night to avoid engagement with American surface forces. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 arrived at Tulagi Island in April 1943 as part of the American response to the Tokyo Express. The squadron operated from crude bases hacked out of jungle on small islands, living in tents, refueling from hand pumps, and reloading torpedoes under palm trees while enemy aircraft flew overhead. The mission was straightforward: intercept the Tokyo Express, launch torpedoes, sink destroyers, disrupt the supply line. The execution proved far more difficult. PT-109 was an Elco 80-footer commissioned in July 1942 and assigned to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 in October of that year. By April 1943 the boat had seen action in the Solomons but had yet to sink any enemy vessels. On April 23, 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy assumed command. Kennedy was 25 years old, the son of Joseph Kennedy, former ambassador to Britain. He had joined the Navy after being rejected by the Army due to a back injury suffered playing football at Harvard. Through family connections and persistence, he secured assignment to the PT boat program despite questions about his physical fitness. His boat was not new, it had mechanical issues, required constant maintenance, and its torpedoes had never functioned as advertised during combat. But it was his command, and he intended to make it count. By late July 1943, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 had relocated forward to Rendover Island, closer to the active combat zone. The boats operated from a crude base the sailors called Todd City, a collection of tents, fuel dumps, and torpedo storage carved into the jungle near the shore. 15 PT boats were available for operations, though mechanical issues typically grounded at least a few on any given night. Daily operations at forward bases like Rendover followed a brutal routine. The crews worked 12-hour shifts, sleeping during the day in tents pitched on ground that was perpetually damp from tropical humidity and frequent rain. Daytime temperatures reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity approaching saturation. The combination made rest difficult. Most sailors slept shirtless on canvas cots, using mosquito netting to keep insects away. Malaria was endemic, every man took Atabrin tablets daily, which turned their skin slightly yellow and caused bitter aftertaste but reduced malaria infection rates. Dysentery from contaminated food and water afflicted almost everyone at some point. The medical facilities consisted of a tent with basic supplies and a Navy corpsman who treated everything from infected cuts to shrapnel wounds. Food arrived via supply ships when sea conditions and enemy action permitted. The standard Navy ration included canned meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, and occasionally fresh fruit when available. Refrigeration was limited, so fresh food spoiled quickly. Most meals consisted of canned rations heated over small stoves or eaten cold. The crew supplemented their diet with coconuts gathered from nearby palms, though excessive coconut consumption caused digestive problems, as the PT-109 crew later discovered during their survival ordeal. Water was precious. Fresh water came from rain catchment systems, large tarps stretched over frameworks that channeled rainwater into barrels. The tropical climate provided frequent rain, but the water required treatment with chlorine tablets to kill bacteria. Each PT boat carried water barrels for drinking, but the crews learned to conserve water carefully. Engine cooling systems used seawater, but seawater could not be consumed. Dehydration was a constant risk during combat patrols that lasted 8 to 10 hours in humid heat. The crews worked 12-hour shifts, sleeping during the day, preparing for nighttime patrols. Intelligence reports arrived in the afternoon: how many destroyers were expected, what route they might take, what time they would arrive in the strait. On the evening of August 1, 1943, intelligence indicated 4 Japanese destroyers would make a run through Blackett Strait that night, heading south toward VR to resupply the garrison. This was better odds than the PT boats usually faced. For destroyers meant more targets and potentially more confusion during the attack. 15 PT boats departed Rendover shortly before sunset, arranged in divisions of 3 or 4 boats each, with orders to intercept the Tokyo Express in Blackett Strait and attack with torpedoes. Blackett Strait is a narrow channel of water between Kolombangara Island to the east and Arundel Island and Gizo Island to the west. The strait runs roughly north-south, about 6 miles wide at its narrowest point. Coral reefs line both sides. The water depth varies between 100 and 300 feet. On a moonless night with cloud cover, visibility in the strait drops to near zero. Sailors describe being unable to see the bow of their own boat from the cockpit. In such conditions, navigation relies entirely on compass bearings and dead reckoning, and detecting enemy vessels depends on hearing their engines or seeing their phosphorescent wakes in the water. PT-109 was assigned to Division B, operating with PT-162 and PT-169. The division's assigned patrol station was the eastern side of the strait, between Kolombangara and a small island called Plum Pudding. The 3 boats formed a loose picket line, engines idling, listening for the sound of approaching destroyers. The crews wore Kapok life jackets. Every man had been briefed to abandon ship immediately if the boat was hit. Fire was the greatest danger. Aviation gasoline ignites at low temperatures, and a ruptured fuel tank could turn a PT boat into an inferno within seconds. The Japanese destroyers entered Blackett Strait shortly after midnight. They were Fubuki-class destroyers, 118 meters long, displacing 2,050 tons at full load, armed with 6 127mm guns and 9 torpedo tubes loaded with the devastating Type 93 long-lance torpedo. These destroyers could sustain 34 knots, but their captains pushed them faster when making the rat run, sometimes reaching 38 knots. They traveled in line formation, spaced at intervals, maintaining radio silence, relying on the same darkness that concealed the PT boats to protect them from American surface forces. The first contact came around 0100 hours when PT boats from another division spotted the destroyer column and fired torpedoes. The range was long, the sea stayed choppy, and the torpedoes were Mark 8s that required precise aim and speed calculations to hit. All missed. The destroyers did not slow or alter course. They continued south toward their objective, having detected the PT boats but dismissing them as minor threats. The Japanese destroyer captains had encountered PT boats before and had learned that American torpedoes rarely functioned properly and that the small boats presented minimal danger to ships designed for fleet combat. PT-109 detected the destroyers approaching around 0200 hours. Kennedy and his crew could hear the engine noise across the water, a deep rumble that grew louder as the destroyers closed. Visibility was nearly zero. Kennedy ordered the engine started and attempted to maneuver into attack position, but in the darkness, he could not accurately determine the destroyer's course or speed. Before he could fire torpedoes, the opportunity passed. The destroyers had completed their run south and were already turning to head back north. The destroyers made their delivery at VR and began the return journey, accelerating to higher speeds to clear the strait before dawn. Around 0230 hours, as PT-109 idled in the darkness trying to locate targets, one of the destroyers emerged from the black water 300 yards off the starboard bow. Kennedy saw the phosphorescent bow wave first, then the dark mass of the hull behind it. He spun the wheel hard to starboard, attempting to bring the boat's torpedo tubes to bear, and simultaneously ordered full throttle on all three engines. The Packard engines required several seconds to spool up from idle to full power. The boat began to accelerate, but not fast enough. The destroyer, later identified as Amagiri, was already at combat speed, and the distance closed at a combined rate of over 60 knots. Kohei Hanami, captain of Amagiri, saw the PT boat at the last moment and ordered hard left rudder, not to avoid collision, but to bring his bow to bear and ram the smaller vessel, a standard tactic Japanese destroyer captains used against PT boats. Steel bow met plywood hull at a 60-degree angle just forward of the forward starboard torpedo tube. The impact severed PT-109 at an oblique angle, ripping away the starboard aft quarter of the boat including the starboard engine, fuel tanks, and part of the aft crew compartment. The collision occurred so fast that most of the crew had no time to react. The boat spun violently, throwing men into the water. Aviation gasoline from the ruptured fuel tanks spread across the water surface and ignited instantly. Flames rose 30 feet into the air, illuminating the scene. The forward section of PT-109, containing the bow, the cockpit, and the port and center engines, remained afloat because its sealed forward compartments provided buoyancy. The aft section sank immediately. 2 crewmen died in the collision. Harold Money, manning the forward gun turret, was crushed when the destroyer's bow struck the boat. Andrew Jackson Kirksey, stationed aft, went down with the sinking section. 11 men survived. Some were thrown clear by the impact and found themselves in the water surrounded by burning gasoline. Others clung to the floating forward section of the wreck. Patrick McMahon, the engineer who had been below decks in the engine room, suffered severe burns when the fuel tanks exploded but managed to escape through a hatch before the aft section sank. Kennedy, who had been in the cockpit at the moment of impact, was thrown against the steel compass mount but retained consciousness. He found himself in the water, swimming away from the flames. Around him in the darkness he could hear men shouting. The first priority was to prevent the surviving crew from drowning. Kennedy swam toward the voices, calling out names, trying to account for every man. The burning fuel created enough light to see for a few minutes, but the destroyer's wake dispersed the slick and the fire subsided. Darkness returned. The forward hull of PT-109 remained afloat but capsized slowly as water filled the damaged compartments. Kennedy ordered the men in the water to swim back to the wreck. Several were strong swimmers and made it quickly. Others struggled. William Johnston had swallowed gasoline and could barely function. Charles Harris was exhausted and disoriented. Patrick McMahon was severely burned and nearly unconscious. Kennedy swam to McMahon first, grabbed the strap of his life jacket between his teeth, and towed him back to the wreck, a distance of approximately 100 yards. Then he swam back out for Harris, alternately encouraging him and cursing him to keep swimming. By dawn on August 2nd, all 11 survivors had gathered at the floating wreck. They took inventory of their situation. The boat was sinking slowly, settling lower in the water as the remaining sealed compartments gradually flooded. They had no radio, the radio had been in the aft section that sank. They had no signal flares, those too had gone down. They had no food or fresh water. Several men were injured, McMahon critically so. They were floating in enemy-controlled waters, surrounded by Japanese-held islands, with no way to signal rescue. The wreck remained visible from the air, which meant Japanese aircraft would likely spot them after sunrise. The nearest land was a small island about 3.5 miles to the southeast, visible in daylight as a low green smudge on the horizon. The island appeared uninhabited. If they could reach it before the wreck sank or before Japanese forces found them, they might survive long enough for rescue. But 3.5 miles is a long swim, especially for injured men, and 2 of the crew could not swim at all. Kennedy made the decision to abandon the wreck and swim for the island. The crew dismantled a wooden plank from the deck, about 8 feet long, and lashed the 2 non-swimmers to it. The able-bodied swimmers would push and pull the plank. Kennedy would tow McMahon using the same method as before, gripping the life jacket strap in his teeth and swimming breaststroke. They entered the water around 1,400 hours on August 2nd, approximately 12 hours after the collision, and began the swim. The swim took 5 hours. The current worked against them. The coral reefs they had to cross to reach the island cut their hands and legs. Kennedy swam continuously, never releasing McMahon, pushing through exhaustion and the pain from his injured back. The other men took turns pushing the plank with Johnston and Maurer. By 1900 hours they reached the island, dragging themselves onto a beach covered in bird droppings. The island was indeed uninhabited, too small and too barren to support either a garrison or a native population. It measured roughly 100 yards in diameter, covered in dense scrub brush and coconut palms coated in guano. The men named it Bird Island. They now faced a different problem. They had reached land, but they had no way to signal their location. The island provided coconuts for food and some rainwater trapped in palm fronds, but no substantial resources. More critically, they were not on a shipping lane or patrol route that American forces regularly used. Rescue would not find them by accident. They needed to make contact somehow. Kennedy knew that American PT boats operated in the area at night, using Ferguson Passage to the south as their transit route into Blackett Strait. If he could reach Ferguson Passage after dark, he might intercept a PT patrol and signal them. That night, after resting for a few hours, Kennedy swam out into Ferguson Passage. He brought the boat's battle lantern, wrapped in a life jacket to keep it floating, planning to signal any points he saw. He tread water in the passage for over an hour, watching and listening. No PT boats came. The current began pulling him away from the island, out into Blackett Strait. He had to swim hard to get back to shore, and by the time he reached Bird Island again, he was near collapse. The next night, Kennedy convinced Ensign George Ross to make the same attempt. Ross swam out to a different position in Ferguson Passage and waited. Again, no PT boats appeared. The squadron had suspended operations in Blackett Strait after losing PT-109, uncertain whether Japanese forces had set a trap. By August 4, the crew's condition was deteriorating. The coconuts were causing illness. They had no fresh water except occasional rainwater. McMahon's burns were infected. They needed to find better shelter and, more importantly, make contact with Allied forces. Kennedy decided they should swim to the next island over, Olasano Island, which was larger and closer to Ferguson Passage. Again they entered the water, Kennedy towing McMahon, the other men pushing the plank. They reached Olasano in the early evening. Olasano Island offered more coconuts but still no fresh water or means of signaling. On August 5, Kennedy and Ross swam to the next island in the chain, Nauru Island, also called Cross Island. This island sat at the entrance to Ferguson Passage, positioned where Kennedy might have better chances of spotting PT patrols. On the beach they found a small wooden box with Japanese writing on the label. Inside was Japanese candy, not much, but food. Further up the beach they discovered a one-man canoe hidden in the bushes and a small tin of water. While Kennedy and Ross were examining the canoe, two men appeared near the wrecked Japanese barge on the reef offshore. These men paddled away in a canoe when Kennedy shouted to them. Kennedy feared they were Japanese scouts, but in fact they were islander coast watchers working for the Allies. The two men, Byuku Gasa and Eroni Kumana, had been scouting the islands and spotted the wreck survivors. They were initially frightened by Kennedy's shouts because they assumed any survivors near a Japanese wreck would be Japanese. Gasa and Kumana paddled back to Olasano Island where they encountered Ensign Leonard Tom and the rest of the PT-109 crew. Tom managed to communicate that they were Americans, not Japanese. The two islanders were exhausted and thirsty from their scouting, so they stopped at Olasano for coconuts. Tom convinced them to help. When Kennedy returned to Olasano the next morning, August 6, he learned that Gasa and Kumana had made contact. The two islanders knew where the Allied coast watcher, Lieutenant Arthur Reginald Evans, was stationed. They could carry a message to him. Kennedy needed to compose something that would convey their situation clearly. He had no paper. Gasa showed him that messages could be carved into the husk of a green coconut. Kennedy scratched into the coconut. Noro ISL Commander, native knows posit, he can pilot, 11 alive need small boat, Kennedy. Garza and Kumana took the coconut and paddled off. Kennedy, still not entirely trusting that rescue would come, insisted on taking the one-man canoe out into Ferguson Passage that night with Ross. The sea was rough. Waves swamped the canoe and nearly drowned both men. They barely made it back to Nauru Island. The next morning, August 7th, 8 islanders arrived at Nauru with food and a message from Lieutenant Evans. Kennedy was to come to Evans's Coast Watcher post on Gomu Island. The islanders hid Kennedy under a pile of palm fronds in a canoe and paddled him through enemy waters to reach Evans. Kennedy arrived at Gomu Island that evening, 6 days after PT-109 sank. Evans had already radioed Rendover with the news that PT-109's crew had been found. The base commander proposed sending rescue boats directly to Olasana, but Kennedy insisted on being picked up first so he could guide the boats through the reefs and shallow water that surrounded the islands. Late on the night of August 7th, PT-157 and PT-171 met Kennedy at a rendezvous point near Gomu Island. Kennedy was supposed to signal with 4 shots. His revolver was down to 3 rounds, so he borrowed Evans's rifle for the 4th shot. Standing up in the canoe to fire the rifle, Kennedy failed to brace for the recoil. The rifle kicked him backward into the water. Soaking wet and thoroughly irritated, Kennedy climbed aboard PT-157. The 2 boats crossed Blackett Strait under his direction and approached Olasana Island in the early hours of August 8th. The exhausted crew of PT-109 was asleep on the beach. Kennedy, fueled by relief and medicinal brandy provided by the PT-157 skipper, began shouting for his men, much to the alarm of the rescuers who feared Japanese forces might hear. But no enemy appeared. The survivors of PT-109 were loaded aboard the rescue boats and returned to Rendover, arriving at 0530 hours on August 8, 1943. All 11 survivors made it home. 2 men had died in the collision itself, but everyone who entered the water survived 6 days of swimming, exposure, limited food and water, infected wounds, and enemy territory. Kennedy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his leadership and courage. Several crew members received commendations. The event became known in the squadron as a survival story rather than a combat action. PT-109 had not sunk any enemy ships. It had been cut in half and sunk by a destroyer that barely noticed the impact. By objective measures, the action was a failure. But something larger had been revealed. The PT boat concept, for all its tactical limitations, had demonstrated a peculiar resilience. PT-109 had taken a hit that should have killed everyone aboard. A 2,000-ton destroyer traveling at 38 knots had struck a 56-ton wooden boat with enough force to rip it in half. The fuel tanks had exploded. Fire had spread across the water. The boat sank within minutes. And yet the crew survived because the boat's design, its sealed compartments, its buoyant forward hull, its shallow draft that allowed it to float even when flooded, created survivability where none should have existed. This was not the story the PT boat program had promised. PT boats were supposed to be offensive weapons, striking fast and vanishing before the enemy could react. They were supposed to launch torpedoes from ambush and sink destroyers. They were supposed to level the playing field between a small fast boat and a capital ship. In practice, they rarely achieved these objectives. American torpedoes, whether Mark 8 or Mark 13, suffered from mechanical problems throughout the war. Depth regulators malfunctioned, causing torpedoes to run too deep and pass under targets. Magnetic exploders triggered prematurely or failed to detonate at all. Contact exploders struck armor belts and crumpled without firing. PT boat crews fired hundreds of torpedoes during the Solomons campaign and scored perhaps a dozen confirmed hits on major warships. The torpedoes' failure forced PT boats to adapt. They became gunboats, trading their torpedo tubes for additional 20mm and 37mm cannons and more .50 caliber machine guns. In this role they proved highly effective against Japanese barges and small craft. The Tokyo Express used destroyers to move troops, but it also employed slow wooden barges to shuttle supplies between islands. PT boats slaughtered these barges. A single PT boat with 4.50 caliber machine guns could riddle a barge with hundreds of rounds, setting it on fire and sinking it within minutes. The Japanese began calling PT boats the Green Dragons because their hulls were painted jungle green and their firepower seemed disproportionate to their size. But the primary mission, intercepting and sinking destroyers, remained elusive. The night of August 1 to 2, 1943, when 15 PT boats engaged for Japanese destroyers in Blackett Strait, exemplified the problem. The PT boats fired approximately 30 torpedoes. None hit. The destroyers completed their supply run unscathed and returned north. The only loss was PT-109, rammed and sunk by a destroyer that probably did not even realize it had hit anything until it felt the impact. From a tactical standpoint, the engagement was a complete American failure. Yet from a strategic and psychological standpoint, the PT boats achieved something. They forced the Japanese to route destroyer runs through specific straits at high speed during darkness. They created uncertainty. A destroyer captain racing through Blackett Strait at 38 knots could not afford to slow down or investigate every shadow. He had to assume that PT boats were present, even if he could not see them. This pressure shortened the time available for offloading supplies, reduced the tonnage each destroyer could carry, and increased fuel consumption. The PT boats did not win battles, but they imposed costs. The PT-109 incident became emblematic of this paradox. The boat failed its mission, lost the engagement, and was destroyed. The crew survived through a combination of their commander's determination, their own physical resilience, good fortune, and help from Allied coast watchers and islanders. None of this was supposed to matter in naval warfare. Ships are judged by tonnage sunk, battles won, objectives achieved. By these metrics, PT-109 accomplished nothing. But the story resonated precisely because it was not about victory. It was about endurance. A crew facing overwhelming odds, a destroyer 40 times their weight, traveling too fast to avoid, took the hit, survived it, held together, and made it home. This narrative proved more powerful than any sinking report. When the story reached American newspapers, carried first by Navy intelligence officer Byron White and later expanded by journalist John Hersey, it captured public attention not because it described a great victory but because it described credible courage under impossible circumstances. Kennedy's command decisions during those 6 days became a case study in small unit leadership. He made the decision to swim for the island rather than wait with the wreck, correctly assessing that the wreck would sink and Japanese forces would likely find them. He towed McMahon 3.5 miles through open ocean, refusing to leave the injured man behind even though carrying him dramatically slowed the swim and increased Kennedy's own risk of drowning. He made repeated attempts to reach Ferguson Passage to signal PT boats, exhausting himself in the process but maintaining the initiative rather than passively waiting for rescue. When contact was finally established with the islanders, he ensured the message was clear and actionable, then insisted on personally guiding the rescue boats to avoid further casualties. None of these decisions involved combat. They involved judgment, endurance, and responsibility. They represented leadership of a different kind than what was taught at the Naval Academy, not the leadership of commanding a ship in battle, but the leadership of keeping men alive when everything has gone wrong. This type of leadership mattered more to the PT boat community than any after-action report. The sailors who crewed these boats understood that their survival depended more on the competence and commitment of their officers than on the theoretical firepower of their torpedoes. They knew the boats were fragile. They knew the torpedoes often failed. They knew that in any direct engagement with a Japanese destroyer, they would lose. What they needed was a skipper who would make decisions that gave them the best chance of coming home. Kennedy's subsequent political career drew heavily on the PT-109 story, but the story itself was fundamentally true. He had been given a small command, seen it destroyed through a combination of bad luck and tactical circumstances beyond his control, and brought his crew home. This sequence, command, catastrophe, survival, resonated with voters who understood that leadership is often tested not in victory but in crisis. The PT boat program itself evolved rapidly after the Blackett Strait engagements. Torpedo attacks were gradually de-emphasized. Boats were rearmed as gunboats. Later models added radar, improving nighttime detection capability and reducing the risk of collisions like the one that destroyed PT-109. The boats were used increasingly for coastal patrol, commando insertion, search and rescue, and anti-barge operations. They became utility vessels rather than capital ship hunters. In the Mediterranean theater, PT boats operated more successfully against German and Italian coastal convoys, sinking supply ships and escorts in narrow waters where speed and maneuverability mattered more than armor. In the Philippines, PT boats evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor in March 1942, demonstrating their utility as fast transports. Throughout the Pacific, they provided search and rescue capability, picking up downed pilots from waters too shallow or too contested for larger ships to enter. The Mosquito fleet designation, originally meant as an insult, became a point of pride. The boats were indeed like mosquitoes, small, annoying, difficult to swat, capable of inflicting harm disproportionate to their size when conditions favored them. They did not sink battleships, but they disrupted logistics, harassed convoys, and forced the enemy to allocate resources to defend against them. A Japanese garrison expecting supplies by barge had to assign troops to guard the landing zone against PT boat attack. A destroyer making a supply run had to travel faster and spend less time at the destination, reducing the cargo it could deliver. These incremental effects accumulated. But the deeper legacy of the PT boat in American military culture had less to do with tonnage sunk and more to do with the image it projected: small units operating independently, junior officers making tactical decisions without oversight, speed and initiative substituting for mass and firepower. This image appealed to a democratic military culture that valued individual initiative. It suggested that small groups of well-trained Americans with the right equipment could accomplish what larger formations could not. Whether or not this was tactically true, and the evidence suggests it often was not, the cultural resonance persisted. PT-109's destruction and its crew's survival represented this ideal in its purest form. A small boat, a young officer, a crisis that eliminated every advantage, and a refusal to surrender to circumstances. The fact that the boat was sunk by the enemy, rather than sinking the enemy, did not diminish the story's power. If anything, it enhanced it. The crew had lost the fight but won the survival challenge that followed. They had demonstrated that American sailors, even when their weapons failed and their boat was destroyed, could endure and come home. The wreckage of PT-109 was located in 2002 by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic. It lies in 300 feet of water off Columbangara Island, the torpedo tube still visible, the wooden hull long since consumed by marine organisms. The destroyer Amajiri, which sank PT-109, was herself sunk by a mine in April 1944 off Balikpapan, Borneo. Captain Kohei Hanami survived the war. He and Kennedy never met, though Hanami later expressed regret that the collision had occurred and respect for Kennedy's handling of the survival ordeal. The 11 survivors of PT-109 remained bonded by the experience. They attended Kennedy's presidential inauguration in 1961. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, several of them served as honor guards or attended the funeral. Patrick McMahon, the engineer who suffered severe burns, received a disability pension and remained in contact with Kennedy until the president's death. The coconut shell with Kennedy's carved message was encased in plastic and kept on the president's desk in the Oval Office, a reminder of the night when leadership meant swimming through dark water with another man's life vest strap clenched between your teeth. The broader strategic outcome of the Solomons campaign validated the American approach, though not through PT boat actions. American air superiority eventually made the Tokyo Express unsustainable. Japanese destroyers could race through the straits at night, but they were increasingly ambushed by aircraft at dawn when they tried to return. The losses in destroyers, ships Japan could not replace, eventually forced the Japanese to abandon their island garrisons. The PT boats contributed to this attrition, but they were not the decisive factor. The decisive factors were aircraft carriers, submarines, and the relentless industrial production that allowed America to replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Within this larger context, PT-109's story occupies a modest but distinct place. It demonstrated that even a failed engagement could produce leadership lessons worth preserving. It showed that wooden boats designed for offensive action could absorb catastrophic damage and still protect their crews. It revealed that survival in combat often depends less on firepower than on decision-making, physical endurance, and mutual commitment among crew members. These were not lessons the U.S. Navy had set out to teach when it ordered PT boats into production. They were lessons learned through experience, written in salt water and exhaustion, validated by 11 men who made it home. The final accounting of PT boat effectiveness in World War II remains contested. Approximately 531 points boats were built. Of these, 69 were lost to enemy action, another 12 to accidents and weather. The boats served in every theater: Pacific, Mediterranean, English Channel. They sank an estimated 200 vessels, though the vast majority were small craft, barges, and coastal ships rather than major warships. Against their design targets, destroyers, cruisers, and capital ships, their success rate was low. The torpedoes failed too often, the boats were too fragile to close to effective range against alert opponents, and the tactical doctrine that envisioned swarms of PT boats overwhelming destroyer screens never materialized in practice. Yet they succeeded in other ways. They provided coastal patrol capability. They rescued downed pilots. They inserted and extracted commandos. They harassed enemy logistics. They forced the enemy to allocate defensive resources. They provided young officers with independent command experience. They became symbols of American ingenuity and fighting spirit, small fast boats crewed by volunteers taking the fight to the enemy in contested waters. The image mattered, even when the tactical reality fell short of expectations. PT-109's place within this history is unique. It was not the most successful PT boat, it sank no enemy ships. It was not the most decorated, other boats and crews received higher honors for combat actions. It was not the first or last PT boat lost in combat. But it was the boat whose loss generated a survival story that defined what the PT boat community wanted to believe about itself, that when skill and firepower failed, determination and leadership could still bring the crew home. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world. The destroyer Amajiri represented the technological opposite of the PT boat concept. Where PT boats relied on speed and stealth, destroyers combined speed with firepower and survivability. The Fubuki-class destroyers, of which Amajiri was one, had revolutionized destroyer design when they entered service in 1928. They displaced 1,750-ton standard, measured 118 meters in length, and carried a main battery of 6 127mm guns in 3 twin turrets, 2 forward, 1 aft. These guns could fire 15 rounds per minute to an effective range of 19,000 yards. The destroyers also carried 9 610mm torpedo tubes in 3 triple mounts, loaded with the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, arguably the most lethal torpedo in the world. The Type 93 Long Lance used pure oxygen instead of compressed air to run its engine, eliminating the telltale bubble wake that revealed the presence of conventional torpedoes. It carried a 1,080-pound warhead, traveled at 48 to 50 knots, and had a range exceeding 40,000 yards at slower speeds. A single Long Lance hit could sink a cruiser. 3 hits could cripple a battleship. Japanese destroyer captains trained extensively in night torpedo attacks, developing tactics that emphasized surprise, accurate range estimation, and coordinated salvo firing. The Imperial Japanese Navy considered its destroyers to be primary offensive weapons, not merely escorts for capital ships. Amajiri's captain, Kohei Hanami, had commanded the destroyer since November 1942. He had run the Tokyo Express dozens of times, threading through the Solomons at high speed while American PT boats stalked the straits. He knew the small boats were present every night. He had seen their wakes phosphorescing in the darkness, heard their engines rumbling across the water. His standing orders were to avoid engagement if possible. His mission was to deliver troops and supplies, not to hunt PT boats. But if a PT boat appeared in his path, his orders permitted ramming. The destroyer's reinforced bow could cleave through a wooden hull without slowing the ship or causing significant damage. Japanese destroyer captains had rammed PT boats before. Hanami had no reason to believe this night would be different. When Amagiari's lookout spotted PT-109 at 300 yards, Hanami had perhaps 15 seconds to make a decision. He could attempt to evade by turning hard right, opening the range, and trusting his ship's speed to carry him clear. But evasive maneuver would take him off course, potentially separating him from the other destroyers in the column and exposing him to torpedo attack from other PT boats that might be lurking nearby. Or he could turn hard left, bringing his bow to bear on the target, and ram. The ramming course maintained his general heading through the strait and eliminated the threat immediately. Hanami chose to ram. He ordered hard left rudder. Amagiari's bow swung toward PT-109. Kennedy saw the destroyer's bow wave first, a line of phosphorescence cutting through the black water. Then he saw the dark mass behind it, enormous, moving impossibly fast. He spun PT-109's wheel to starboard, attempting to bring the torpedo tubes to bear for a point-blank shot, and simultaneously ordered the engines advance to full throttle. The Packard engines were idling, running at perhaps 800 RPM. They needed 8 to 10 seconds to spool up to full power. The distance to the destroyer closed at 65 knots, approximately 110 feet per second. In the time it took for the engines to respond, Amagiari crossed two-thirds of the remaining distance. PT-109 began to accelerate, but not nearly fast enough. The collision occurred at 0237 hours according to Amagiari's log. The destroyer's bow struck PT-109 at an oblique angle, hitting forward of the starboard torpedo tube and continuing aft along the starboard side. The mahogany hull offered no resistance. Amagiari's bow sliced through the planking, frames, and bulkheads as if they did not exist. The impact severed the starboard aft quarter of the boat, including the starboard engine, associated fuel tanks, and the aft crew compartment where 2 men were stationed. The severed section sank immediately. The forward section, containing the bow, cockpit, and the 2 port engines, remained afloat because sealed compartments in the bow trapped air that provided buoyancy. The rupture of the fuel tanks created an immediate fire hazard. Aviation gasoline poured from severed fuel lines, spreading across the water surface as a thin film. The hot engine components ignited the gasoline vapor, creating a flash fire that spread across 30 to 40 yards of water within seconds. Men in the water found themselves surrounded by flames. The flames rose 20 feet high, casting flickering orange light across the scene. For the first time that night, the sailors could see clearly. They could see the destroyer pulling away to the north, they could see the floating bow section of PT-109, they could see each other struggling in the water, and they could see the fire spreading toward them. Harold Money, manning the forward gun turret, died instantly when the destroyer's bow struck. The impact crushed the turret and the man inside it. Money likely never knew what hit him. One moment he was scanning the darkness for targets, the next moment he ceased to exist. Andrew Jackson Crooksey, stationed in the aft section, went down with that portion of the boat when it sank. Whether he was killed by the impact or drowned in the sinking hull was never determined. His body was never recovered. The remaining 11 crew members entered the water under varying circumstances. Kennedy, thrown from the cockpit by the impact, surfaced 20 yards from the wreck. John Maguire, the radioman, was thrown even farther when the collision catapulted him from his position. He surfaced disoriented, having swallowed seawater, but conscious. Patrick McMahon, the engineer, had been below decks in the engine room when the collision occurred. The impact threw him against machinery, and the subsequent fuel ignition burned him severely before he could escape. He managed to crawl through a hatch to the deck and roll into the water, but his hands, arms, and face were burned deeply enough to expose raw tissue. He was in shock and barely conscious. Raymond Starkey had been thrown clear and found himself floating in darkness away from the wreck and the fire. William Johnston had ingested gasoline fumes and seawater and was vomiting, barely able to keep himself afloat despite his Kapok life jacket. Charles Harris was exhausted and disoriented, treading water but making no progress toward the wreck. Ensign Leonard Tom, Ensign George Ross, Gerard Zinsser, Raymond Albert, and Edgar Maurer had either jumped clear or been thrown into the water near the wreck, and they managed to swim back to the floating bow section relatively quickly. Kennedy, after surfacing and orienting himself, began swimming toward the voices calling in the darkness. He called out names, doing a verbal roll call, trying to account for all 13 men. He heard responses from 9 men. He did not hear Moni or Cruxy, and he correctly assumed they were dead. He could hear McMahon, but McMahon's responses were weak and incoherent. Kennedy swam toward McMahon's voice. The fire presented an immediate problem. The burning fuel floated on the water surface, spreading with the current and the waves. The men in the water had to swim through or around the fire to reach the wreck. Some submerged and swam underwater to avoid the flames. Others found gaps in the burning slick and swam through those. Kennedy reached McMahon and found him barely conscious, floating face up in his life jacket but unable to swim. Kennedy grabbed the strap of McMahon's life jacket, placed it between his teeth, and began towing him toward the wreck using a breaststroke swim. The distance was approximately 100 yards. The swim took 15 minutes, Kennedy pausing periodically to rest and to call out to other survivors. Meanwhile, the destroyer Amajiri continued north through the strait. Captain Hanami knew he had hit something, the impact was unmistakable. But he did not know exactly what he had hit or whether it had been destroyed. He did not slow or turn back. His mission was to clear the strait before dawn, and he maintained speed. Amajiri's log recorded the collision as rammed enemy motor torpedo boat, result unknown. The destroyer suffered no significant damage. Some paint was scraped from the bow, and possibly some minor denting of the bow plating, but nothing that affected the ship's seaworthiness or combat capability. From Hanami's perspective, the encounter was minor, a brief contact, a small explosion astern, then nothing. He assumed the PT boat had been destroyed and its crew killed. He was wrong. The physics of the collision, examined from an engineering perspective, reveal why PT-109's crew survived. The destroyer struck at an angle, delivering a glancing blow rather than a direct perpendicular impact. This meant that much of the collision energy was dissipated laterally, pushing the PT boat sideways and tearing it apart, rather than crushing it frontally. If Amajiri had struck PT-109 directly bow-on, the smaller vessel would have been compressed like an accordion, the energy of the impact transmitted through every frame and bulkhead, likely killing every man aboard through blunt force trauma. The angled impact, while still devastating, created a shearing failure mode that severed part of the boat but left the forward section structurally intact. The buoyancy of the forward section resulted from the Elco design's compartmentalization. The bow contained sealed storage compartments and a crew berthing area that was watertight when the hatches were closed. These compartments trapped air when the boat was damaged, providing flotation even when the rest of the hull was flooding or missing. The Elco designers had incorporated this compartmentalization primarily to prevent the entire boat from sinking if one section was holed by gunfire, but it proved equally effective against catastrophic structural failure from collision. The survival of the crew owed much to the Kapok life jackets every man wore. These jackets consisted of canvas shells stuffed with kapok fiber, a natural material harvested from tropical trees. Kapok is hydrophobic and buoyant, providing approximately 35 pounds of lift when fully immersed. The jackets kept unconscious or injured men afloat even when they could not swim. McMahon, severely burned and in shock, survived only because his life jacket held his head above water. Johnston, incapacitated by gasoline ingestion, floated in his jacket until he recovered enough strength to swim. But life jackets and hull compartmentalization only bought time. The men still faced exposure, hypothermia, shark attack, and the likelihood that no one knew they had survived. PT-109 had been operating under radio silence. The radio equipment sank with the aft section of the boat. The squadron command back at Rendova knew that PT-109 had been assigned to Blackett Strait that night, but they did not know the boat had been sunk. When PT-109 failed to return after dawn, the initial assumption was mechanical failure or perhaps that the boat had taken shelter in a cove somewhere along the coast. The possibility that the crew was alive in the water or on an island was considered, but without a known position, organizing a search was problematic. The waters around Blackett Strait were contested, Japanese forces controlled most of the islands, and sending rescue boats into the area in daylight invited air attack. Kennedy and his crew clung to the floating bow section through the remainder of the night, waiting for dawn. As the sky lightened around 0600 hours, they could assess their situation properly for the first time. The bow section was slowly sinking, settling lower in the water as the sealed compartments gradually flooded through small leaks and gaps opened by the collision. The wreck would remain afloat for perhaps another 12 to 18 hours, but it was clearly not a sustainable refuge. More concerning, the wreck was visible from the air. Japanese aircraft flew regular patrols over the Solomons, and a floating wreck would attract attention. The nearest land was visible to the southeast, a low green island perhaps 3.5 miles away. The island appeared small and uninhabited. Kennedy recognized it from the charts he had studied. It was called Plum Pudding Island, though he did not know whether Japanese forces occupied it. The swim would be long and difficult, especially for the injured men and the non-swimmers, but staying with the wreck guaranteed discovery by Japanese forces. Kennedy made the decision to abandon the wreck and swim for the island. The crew spent the late morning and early afternoon of August 2 preparing for the swim. They removed their shoes, which would create drag in the water. They discarded unnecessary gear. They found a wooden plank in the wreckage, about 8 feet long and 6 inches wide, and lashed it between 2 life jackets to create a makeshift raft for the 2 men who could not swim, William Johnston and Edgar Maurer. The plan was for the able-bodied swimmers to push and pull this improvised raft while Kennedy towed McMahon separately. They entered the water around 1,400 hours. Kennedy took the strap of McMahon's life jacket between his teeth and began swimming. The breaststroke allowed him to generate forward progress while keeping McMahon's head above water. The other 9 men clustered around the plank, some pushing, some pulling, some simply swimming alongside and helping when the plank threatened to tip or when one of the men on it started to slip off. The swim was exhausting. The current worked against them, requiring constant effort just to maintain progress toward the island. The water temperature was approximately 80 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent hypothermia but not comfortable. The sun beat down on them, dehydrating them and burning exposed skin. The salt water stung their cuts and abrasions from the collision. Progress was slow. The able-bodied swimmers made perhaps half a mile per hour, and they had to pause frequently to rest and to readjust the plank when it shifted. Kennedy never stopped swimming. He maintained a steady breaststroke rhythm, pausing only briefly when fatigue forced him to rest, then resuming. McMahon, semi-conscious and in severe pain from his burns, could not help. He was dead weight, approximately 170 pounds of mass that Kennedy had to pull through the water for 3.5 miles. The swim took approximately 5 hours. They reached Plum Pudding Island around 1900 hours, well after sunset. The island was indeed uninhabited, too small to support even a small garrison, and too covered in bird droppings to be attractive for any purpose. The men dragged themselves onto the beach and collapsed. Several vomited from exhaustion and salt water ingestion. Kennedy had to be helped out of the water by the men he had been leading. His back injury from his college football days had flared up during the swim, leaving him barely able to stand. His jaw ached from clenching McMahon's life jacket strap for 5 hours. They were alive, but their situation had not fundamentally improved. They were on land, but it was hostile land. They had no food except coconuts, and coconuts alone were insufficient nutrition. They had no fresh water, the island had no streams or springs, and rainwater collection would require containers they did not possess. They had no shelter, no medical supplies for McMahon's burns, no signaling equipment, and no knowledge of whether anyone was looking for them. That night, Kennedy decided to attempt to reach Ferguson Passage, the channel that American PT boats used when transiting to and from Blackett Strait. If he could reach the passage and intercept a PT patrol, he could signal them and guide them back to the island for rescue. The plan was dangerous. Ferguson Passage was more than a mile from Plum Pudding Island, and swimming at night in open water without a life jacket risked drowning or shark attack. But staying on the island guaranteed slow deterioration. Kennedy chose action over passivity. He entered the water around 2,200 hours, carrying the boat's battle lantern wrapped in a life jacket for flotation. The battle lantern was a waterproof flashlight designed for signaling. Kennedy's plan was to swim out into Ferguson Passage, tread water while watching for PT boats, and signal them with the lantern when they appeared. He swam for over an hour, reaching a position where he believed he was in the passage. He treaded water, watching and listening. The night was dark, the water black, the only sounds the gentle slap of waves. He waited. No PT boats came. The squadron had suspended patrols through Ferguson Passage that night, uncertain whether the Japanese were setting an ambush after the previous night's action. Around midnight, Kennedy realized no boats were coming. He turned to swim back to Plum Pudding Island. The current had carried him farther out than he realized. He swam for what felt like hours, making little progress. The current was pulling him out into Blackett Strait, away from the island. He began to tire. The combination of exhaustion from the previous night's collision, the 5-hour swim to the island, and now several more hours of swimming overwhelmed him. He stopped swimming and simply floated, conserving energy, allowing the current to carry him. He may have lost consciousness briefly. At some point, the current shifted, carrying him back toward the island chain. He washed up on Liarava Island, a small island southeast of Plum Pudding, around 0400 hours on August 3rd. Kennedy slept on Liarava Island for several hours, recovering enough strength to swim the final distance back to Plum Pudding. He arrived around noon on August 3rd, having been gone nearly 14 hours. The crew had assumed he was dead. His reappearance lifted morale temporarily, but his report that no PT boats had come through Ferguson Passage deepened their sense of isolation. Ensign George Ross volunteered to make the same attempt the following night. Ross was a strong swimmer, and Kennedy was clearly in no condition to swim again so soon. Ross entered the water on the night of August 3rd and swam out to Ferguson Passage. Like Kennedy, he waited for hours, treading water, watching for boats. Like Kennedy, he saw nothing. He returned to Plum Pudding Island in the early morning of August 4th, exhausted and discouraged. The crew was now entering its third day of survival. Coconuts were causing digestive problems, several men had diarrhea. Dehydration was becoming serious. McMahon's burns were infected, the exposed tissue turning red and swollen. Morale was deteriorating. Some of the men were beginning to accept that they would not be rescued, that they would die slowly on this barren island. Kennedy refused to accept this outcome. He decided the crew should move to Olasana Island, the next island in the chain toward Ferguson Passage. Olasana was larger, potentially had more coconuts and perhaps fresh water, and was closer to Ferguson Passage, which might improve their chances of intercepting a PT boat or being spotted by search aircraft. On the afternoon of August 4th, the crew entered the water again for another long swim. Kennedy resumed towing McMahon. The other men pushed and pulled the plank. They reached Olasana Island that evening, once again exhausted but now marginally closer to potential rescue. Olasana offered little improvement. The coconuts were more plentiful but had the same sickening effect. There was no obvious source of fresh water. The island was larger, which meant more area to explore but also more area where Japanese patrols might land without the crew noticing. Kennedy decided he and Ross should scout the next island, Nauru Island, which sat at the very edge of Ferguson Passage. If Nauru offered any resources or vantage points, the crew could move there. If not, at least Kennedy would have surveyed all available options. On the morning of August 5th, Kennedy and Ross swam to Nauru Island. They found the small wooden box containing Japanese candy, a welcome discovery that provided sugar and calories. They found the tin of water, even more valuable. And they found the one-man canoe hidden in the bushes, the most important discovery of all. A canoe meant mobility. Kennedy could paddle out into Ferguson Passage more efficiently than swimming, and he could bring supplies or other crew members if needed. While they were examining the canoe, they spotted two men near the wrecked Japanese barge out on the reef. Kennedy shouted to them, trying to get their attention. The men, startled, paddled away quickly in their canoe. Kennedy assumed they were Japanese and that they would report the presence of American survivors to their garrison. He and Ross prepared for the possibility of a Japanese patrol arriving to capture or kill them.